Picture a frozen landscape in the English countryside winter of 1944. Across the fields, strange metal tunnels emerge from the snow like giant steel worms. Inside these corrugated structures, thousands of British families huddle against the cold. These are Nissen huts, and they're about to become the setting for one of World War II's most buried moral crises. The winter wind cuts through the thin metal walls like a knife through butter. Condensation drips from the curved ceiling, forming small puddles on the concrete floor. A mother wraps her 2 children in every blanket she owns, their breath visible in the frigid air. This is home now. Not the cozy brick house in London that was reduced to rubble 18 months ago, but a semicircular tunnel of corrugated steel, 20 feet wide and 30 feet long, shared with another family separated only by a hanging curtain. Outside, the landscape stretches in monotonous rows. Dozens of identical metal structures, all aligned in military precision, creating a temporary city of displaced souls. Smoke rises from small chimneys, carrying the smell of coal and whatever meager rations families have managed to cook. Children in oversized coats play in the mud between huts, their games a strange mixture of innocence and war. They pretend to be pilots, soldiers, air raid wardens. The war has shaped even their imagination. These structures were never meant for this. They were never designed to house families through brutal British winters. They were military barracks invented during the First World War by a Canadian engineer named Peter Nissen, who needed a solution for housing troops quickly and cheaply on the Western Front. The design was brilliantly simple: curved sheets of corrugated steel bolted to a steel frame, creating a self-supporting arch. No skilled labor required, no complex materials. A small team could erect one in 4 hours. The genius of the design lay in its efficiency. The curved shape distributed weight evenly, making the structure remarkably strong despite using minimal materials. The corrugated steel provided rigidity, while remaining lightweight enough to transport easily. Everything could be prefabricated and shipped in sections, then assembled on site with basic tools. For military logistics, it was perfect, but simplicity came with a price. The metal conducted cold, like it was designed for it. In winter, ice formed on the inside walls. Families would wake to find frost patterns decorating the interior, beautiful and miserable in equal measure. In summer, the huts became ovens, the metal absorbing and radiating heat until the interior temperature became unbearable. There was no insulation, no proper ventilation, no privacy. They were ugly, uncomfortable, and deeply unpopular with the soldiers who first inhabited them. One British officer called them steel coffins. Another described living in one as camping in a biscuit tin. A third wrote in his diary that the huts were monuments to the principle that function matters more than comfort, and that both matter less than speed. Yet when the Luftwaffe began dropping bombs on British cities in 1940, ugliness became irrelevant. During the Blitz, German bombers destroyed or damaged over 2 million homes. Entire neighborhoods vanished overnight. Families who had lived in the same houses for generations found themselves with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The government faced an unprecedented housing crisis. Where do you put millions of displaced people when your cities are burning and your construction industry is focused on building weapons and fortifications? The answer was already sitting in storage. Thousands of Nissen huts left over from the First World War or manufactured for military use were rapidly converted into emergency civilian housing. They were erected in fields, in parks, on the outskirts of towns, anywhere flat ground could be found. Entire communities of these metal tunnels appeared almost overnight, housing 200, 300, sometimes 500 families in a single camp. The government called them temporary accommodations. That was 1940. By 1944, hundreds of thousands of British civilians were still living in them, and many would remain there until the 1950s. Temporary had become permanent. The ugly metal tunnels had become home. Some families would spend nearly a decade in these structures, watching their children grow up in spaces designed for soldiers on temporary deployment. Life inside a Nissen hut required adaptation and resilience. Families learned to stuff newspapers into the gaps between metal sheets to slow the wind. They hung multiple layers of curtains to create the illusion of separate rooms. They placed buckets strategically to catch the condensation that dripped constantly from the ceiling. In winter, A single small stove in the center of the hut provided the only heat, and fuel was rationed. Families went to bed wearing coats, hats, and gloves. Some slept in shifts, taking turns staying awake to keep the fire going through the coldest hours. The concrete floors were brutally cold. Families who could afford it laid down whatever materials they could find. Old carpets, cardboard, layers of newspaper. Those who couldn't afford anything walked on bare concrete that seemed to draw warmth from their bodies. Chilblains were common. Respiratory infections spread quickly in the damp, cold environment. The elderly and very young were particularly vulnerable. Privacy was a luxury that no longer existed. The curtain separating one family from another was thin fabric, often just old bed sheets or blankets hung on a wire. Every conversation, every argument, every crying child could be heard by neighbors. Families learned to speak in whispers, to have difficult conversations outside regardless of the weather, to pretend they hadn't heard the intimate sounds of life from the other side of the curtain. Communal toilets and washing facilities meant queuing in the cold, often in the dark during blackout hours. Cooking was done on shared stoves or small personal burners that filled the huts with smoke, and the smell of whatever meager rations could be stretched into a meal. The ration system meant creativity became essential. Women traded recipes for making something edible from powdered eggs and tinned meat. They learned to make mock versions of foods that were no longer available. Mock cream from margarine and milk powder. Mock banana from parsnips and banana flavoring. Mock goose from potatoes and apples. Children who were born during the war years grew up never tasting real chocolate, real oranges, real butter. The Nissen hut communities developed their own informal economy, trading goods and services, bartering skills for food. But humans are remarkably adaptable. Communities formed. Despite the hardship, or perhaps because of it, the people living in these camps developed strong bonds. Children played between the huts, creating games and adventures in the muddy spaces between the metal tunnels. They built forts from scrap materials, organized elaborate pretend battles, and formed friendships that would last lifetimes. Women organized shared childcare, pooled resources, and created support networks that helped everyone survive. When one family received a care package or a windfall of extra rations, it was often shared with neighbors who had less. Men who weren't away fighting formed work crews, repairing huts, improving drainage, building small additions. They constructed communal spaces, a shelter where people could gather, a small building that served as a school for the children, a workshop where tools could be shared. The camps developed their own social structures, their own hierarchies, their own sense of identity. People took pride in their huts, decorating the interiors with whatever they could find, planting small gardens in the spaces between structures when spring came. There were dances organized in the largest hut or in a nearby building. There were birthday parties for children, celebrations when someone received good news from the front, communal mourning when bad news arrived. Life continued, adapted to circumstances that would have seemed unimaginable just a few years earlier. The British capacity for muddling through was on full display. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't dignified, but it was survival. And in 1944, survival was enough. People told themselves it would end soon. The war couldn't last forever. Eventually, they would return to normal houses, normal lives. The Nissen huts were just temporary, just a little longer. Then the Americans arrived. Starting in 1942, the United States began deploying troops to Britain in preparation for the eventual invasion of Europe. By 1944, over 1.5 million American servicemen were stationed across the British Isles. They were everywhere, in cities, in small towns, in the countryside, and many of their bases were located near the Nissen hut camps that housed displaced British civilians. The proximity was practical from a military standpoint. The camps were already established, infrastructure existed, and the locations were often near strategic sites. But the proximity also created a complex social dynamic that would have far-reaching consequences. The British had a phrase for the American presence: overpaid, oversexed, and over here. It was said with a mixture of humor, resentment, and exhausted tolerance. The Americans earned roughly 5 times what British soldiers made. A private in the U.S. Army took home more pay than a British sergeant. They had access to goods that had been unavailable to British civilians for years: chocolate, cigarettes, coffee, nylon stockings, chewing gum, fresh fruit, things that British children had forgotten existed. The Americans seemed untouched by the years of grinding hardship that had worn down the British population. They were confident, loud, and carried themselves with an ease that felt almost alien to people who had been living under rationing and bombing for 5 years. They had new uniforms, well-fitted and clean. British soldiers, by contrast, often wore patched and faded uniforms, their equipment showing the wear of years of use. For children in the Nissen hut camps, the Americans were magical. They handed out candy bars with a generosity that seemed limitless. They showed up with baseballs and comic books, teaching British children games they'd never seen before. They organized impromptu baseball games in fields, drawing crowds of fascinated spectators who had no idea what the rules were but enjoyed the spectacle. They brought music that felt impossibly modern and alive. Swing, jazz, big band sounds that made people want to dance despite everything. For women, especially young women, the Americans represented something more complicated. They were charming, generous, and offered a glimpse of normalcy in a world that had forgotten what normal felt like. American soldiers took British women to dances, to pubs, on walks through the countryside. They were attentive, complimentary, and seemed genuinely interested in the lives of women who had been struggling just to survive. For women whose husbands or boyfriends had been away for years, or who had lost partners to the war, the attention was both welcome and confusing. The Americans also represented possibility. Marriage to an American soldier meant the chance to leave Britain after the war, to start fresh in a country that hadn't been bombed, that had plenty of food, that promised prosperity and opportunity. Tens of thousands of British women would eventually become GI brides, marrying American soldiers and emigrating to the United States. For women living in Nissen huts with no home to return to and uncertain futures, that possibility was powerfully attractive. But beneath the surface of this cultural exchange, power dynamics were shifting in dangerous ways. The women living in Nissen hut camps were among the most vulnerable people in Britain. They had lost their homes, often their husbands were away fighting or dead, and they were living in temporary structures with minimal security and no privacy. They were economically desperate, socially displaced, and physically exposed. The huts had no locks. The camps had no security patrols. The lighting was minimal, especially during blackout hours. The American soldiers had money, resources, and the backing of a military institution that was largely unaccountable to British law. When an American serviceman committed a crime on British soil, he was subject to American military justice, not British civilian courts. This created a jurisdictional gray zone that would have devastating consequences. British police could investigate, but they couldn't arrest American soldiers. They could gather evidence, but they couldn't prosecute. All they could do was turn their findings over to American military authorities and hope for justice. The numbers tell a story that was buried for decades. Between 1942 and 1945, American military records document over 400 cases of sexual crimes committed by U.S. servicemen in the European theater. 126 of those cases occurred in the United Kingdom alone. These are official numbers, recorded in military documents that were classified for decades and only became available to researchers long after the war ended. But researchers who have studied this period believe these official numbers represent only a fraction of the actual crimes. Many victims never reported what happened to them. Some didn't know how to report, especially refugees and displaced persons who didn't speak English well and had no understanding of the system. Some reported to authorities who dismissed their claims or actively discouraged them from pursuing cases. Some were threatened into silence. The real number of victims is estimated to be in the thousands, possibly tens of thousands across all of occupied and liberated Europe. Why didn't they report? The reasons are complex and heartbreaking. Many women feared retaliation. The soldiers who assaulted them had friends, entire units who might target them or their families. In the close quarters of a Nissen hut camp, where everyone knew everyone and privacy was impossible, becoming a target meant living in constant fear. Some feared they wouldn't be believed. The social stigma attached to sexual assault victims was immense. A woman who came forward risked being labeled as promiscuous, as having invited the attack, as being morally suspect. The prevailing attitude was that respectable women didn't get assaulted. If something happened to you, you must have done something to encourage it. You must have been drinking or wearing something inappropriate or going somewhere you shouldn't have been. This victim blaming was pervasive and devastating. In a close-knit Nissen hut community where everyone knew everyone else's business, that stigma could be unbearable. Women who were assaulted often found themselves ostracized, whispered about, blamed for their own victimization. There was also intense political pressure to stay silent. Britain and America were allies fighting an existential war against Nazi Germany. Anything that threatened that alliance was seen as dangerous, even treasonous. Women who accused American soldiers of crimes were sometimes told explicitly that they were undermining the war effort, that they were helping Hitler by creating division between Allied forces. The message was clear: your trauma is less important than maintaining good relations with our American partners. Your suffering matters less than the political alliance. Local authorities sometimes actively discouraged women from reporting. Police officers, government officials, even clergy members told victims that pursuing cases would cause trouble, would damage important relationships, would make things difficult for everyone. Better to stay quiet, to move on, to accept that these things happen in wartime. Some women were told that American soldiers were under tremendous stress, that they were about to risk their lives in combat, that allowances should be made for their behavior. And then there was the justice system itself, or rather, the lack of one. When cases were reported and investigated, they were handled by American military courts. British authorities had limited ability to intervene. They could provide evidence, but they had no control over whether charges were filed, how cases were prosecuted, or what sentences were imposed. The outcomes were deeply inconsistent and often reflected the racial prejudices of the American military, rather than the facts of the cases. Black American soldiers were disproportionately prosecuted and punished. Of the American servicemen executed for crimes in the European theater during World War II, a vastly disproportionate number were black, despite black soldiers making up only about 10% of U.S. forces. The military justice system reflected the Jim Crow racism that pervaded American society. Black soldiers faced harsher charges, shorter trials, and more severe sentences than white soldiers accused of identical crimes. Meanwhile, white soldiers accused of similar crimes often received light sentences, transfers to other units, or had their cases quietly dropped. Officers were particularly protected. The military was deeply invested in maintaining morale and the reputation of American forces. Prosecuting soldiers, especially white soldiers and officers, was seen as bad for morale, bad for the war effort, bad for America's image. So cases were buried, evidence was lost, witnesses were intimidated, and justice was denied. This wasn't justice. It was a system designed to protect the institution, not the victims. And everyone knew it. British authorities knew it. American officers who cared about justice knew it. And most importantly, the victims knew it. They knew that reporting meant reliving their trauma, facing public scrutiny and blame, and likely seeing no consequences for their attackers. Given those odds, staying silent seemed like the only rational choice. So what happened when someone witnessed a crime? What choice did they face? Imagine you're living in a Nissen hut camp in East Anglia, winter of 1944. You're a mother with 2 young children. Your husband is somewhere in France if he's still alive. You haven't heard from him in 3 months. The last letter was brief, censored, telling you nothing about where he was or what he was doing. You're surviving on rations, living in a metal tunnel that's freezing cold, and every day is a struggle to keep your children fed and warm and safe. One evening you're walking back from the communal washroom. It's dark, the blackout is in effect, and you're navigating by memory and the faint light of a quarter moon. You hear something behind one of the huts. A woman's voice, frightened, saying no. The word is clear, desperate. You move closer and see an American soldier forcing himself on a young woman you recognize from the camp. A Polish refugee who speaks limited English and has no family in Britain. She's crying, struggling, clearly terrified. You shout. The soldier runs. The woman is crying, her clothes torn, her face bruised. You help her back to her hut. Try to comfort her. Ask if she wants to report what happened. She refuses. She's terrified. She has no papers, no legal status, no protection. She's in Britain on temporary refugee status, dependent on the goodwill of authorities who could deport her at any time. If she makes trouble, if she accuses an American soldier, she could be sent back to Poland, which is still under Nazi occupation. She could be killed. She begs you to say nothing, grabs your arm with desperate strength, makes you promise. But you know who the soldier is. You've seen him around the camp before. He comes with a group of Americans who visit regularly, bringing gifts, flirting with the women, playing with the children. He'll come back. There are dozens of other vulnerable women in the camp. Your own daughter is only 12, but she's starting to look older. The Americans have noticed her, made comments that make you uncomfortable. What do? If you report what you saw, you're putting yourself and your family at risk. The soldier has friends. They know where you live. Your hut has no lock on the door. You could be targeted, harassed, or worse. You've heard stories from other camps, whispered warnings about women who reported crimes and then faced retaliation. Threats, vandalism, violence. The American military police can't be everywhere, and even when they are, they're protecting their own. The camp administrators might see you as a troublemaker, someone who's damaging relations with the nearby American base. The base provides resources to the camp. Extra food sometimes, medical supplies, help with repairs. If you cause problems, those resources might disappear. The camp administrator might decide you're more trouble than you're worth. In a time when housing is scarce and you have nowhere else to go, being labeled a troublemaker could mean losing even this inadequate shelter. You could find yourself and your children on the street. Your neighbors might turn against you. Many of them have positive relationships with American soldiers. Some are in romantic relationships, hoping to marry Americans and escape to a better life in the United States after the war. If you make accusations against a GI, you're threatening those relationships, those hopes. You're suggesting that the Americans aren't all heroes, that some of them are dangerous. People don't want to hear that. They want to believe in the alliance, in the liberation, in the promise of victory and peace. You could find yourself ostracized, isolated in a community where mutual support is the only thing making survival possible. No one to watch your children when you need to queue for rations. No one to share fuel when yours runs out. No one to help when you're sick or your children are sick. The social network that keeps you alive could disappear overnight. And even if you report it, what are the chances of justice? The American military will investigate, maybe. They'll interview the soldier who will deny everything. It's your word against his. The victim won't testify. There are no other witnesses. The case will be closed. Nothing will change except now you've made yourself a target. You've sacrificed your safety, your family's safety, your place in the community for nothing. Or you could stay silent. Pretend you saw nothing. Go back to your hut, tuck your children into bed, and try to forget what you witnessed. The weight of that choice would sit on your chest every time you saw that soldier walking through the camp. Every time you heard about another woman being assaulted. Every time you looked at your own daughter and wondered if she'd be next. Every time you saw the Polish woman, who now avoids eye contact and has stopped coming to communal meals. This was the impossible choice that ordinary people faced. And most chose silence, because survival demanded it. Because protecting your own family had to come first. Because the system was too powerful to fight. Because justice was a luxury that displaced people living in metal tunnels couldn't afford. But some didn't. Hidden in the military archives are records of officers who refused to look away. American and British military personnel who insisted on real investigations, who protected victims, who pushed for prosecutions, even when their superiors ordered them to drop cases. These men risked their careers, faced threats of court-martial, and were often transferred or demoted for their trouble. They understood that they were fighting not just individual criminals, but an entire system designed to protect those criminals. One American captain stationed in southern England spent months documenting a pattern of assaults by soldiers from a particular unit. He interviewed victims, collected evidence, built cases that should have been airtight. He worked with local British police, with medical personnel, with anyone who could provide documentation. His commanding officer ordered him to stop. The captain refused. He was threatened with court-martial for insubordination, for damaging morale, for conduct unbecoming an officer. He continued anyway. Eventually, he was transferred to a combat unit and sent to the front lines, a move that was widely understood as punishment. Officers who made trouble didn't get safe assignments. They got sent where they might be killed. Some of the cases he built did result in prosecutions. Some soldiers were convicted and imprisoned, but the captain's career was effectively over. After the war, he left the military without the commendations or promotions his service record should have earned him. He had chosen justice over career advancement, and the institution made sure he paid for it. There were British officers who did the same. Local police who insisted on investigating crimes even when they had no jurisdiction, who documented everything meticulously and sent reports up the chain of command, reports that were often buried or ignored. Civilian administrators who refused to look away, who advocated for victims, who demanded accountability. Medical personnel who carefully documented injuries, who provided testimony, who treated victims with dignity and compassion when the system treated them with contempt. These people understood that they were fighting a losing battle. The system was too entrenched, too powerful, too invested in protecting itself. But they fought anyway. They documented cases knowing the files might be buried. They testified, knowing their testimony might be ignored. They advocated for victims knowing those victims might never get justice. They did it because they believed it mattered, because they believed that someone had to stand up, because they couldn't live with themselves if they didn't. Why did they do it? In a world where staying silent was safer, easier, and more socially acceptable, why did some people choose to act? The answer is both simple and profound. Because they believed that some things matter more than personal safety. They believed that protecting the vulnerable was a duty that transcended career concerns, social pressure, or political convenience. They believed that if they didn't act, they would be complicit in the crimes they witnessed. They believed that history would judge them not by whether they succeeded, but by whether they tried. This is the narrow path between liberation and fear. The American and British forces were fighting to liberate Europe from Nazi tyranny. The soldiers stationed in Britain were preparing to risk their lives on the beaches of Normandy. Many of them were heroes who would save countless lives and help end one of history's greatest evils. The alliance between Britain and America was essential to winning the war, to defeating fascism, to preserving freedom. But heroism in one context doesn't erase criminality in another. The same uniform could clothe both a liberator and a predator. And the complexity of that reality made it almost impossible for people to process. How do you reconcile gratitude for the soldiers who are fighting for your freedom with horror at the crimes some of those soldiers are committing? How do you demand justice without seeming ungrateful? How do you protect your community without undermining the alliance that's keeping Nazi Germany from winning the war? These weren't abstract philosophical questions. They were immediate, visceral dilemmas that ordinary people had to navigate every single day. And there were no good answers. Every choice involved sacrifice. Every decision had consequences. The people who chose to act, who chose to speak up, who chose to demand justice, paid a price for those choices. But so did the people who stayed silent. The victims of these crimes faced perhaps the most impossible situation of all. Many of them had already been victimized by the war itself. They had lost homes, family members, their entire way of life. Some were refugees who had fled Nazi occupation, who had survived horrors that most people couldn't imagine. They had come to Britain seeking safety, seeking liberation, seeking a place where they could rebuild their lives. And then they were assaulted by the soldiers who were supposed to represent that liberation. The psychological impact of that betrayal is difficult to overstate. These women had placed their hope in the Allied forces, had believed that the Americans and British represented safety and justice and freedom. To be violated by those same forces was to have that hope shattered, to have the foundation of their belief in a just world destroyed. Some victims never recovered. They carried the trauma in silence for the rest of their lives, unable to speak about what had happened because the world wasn't ready to hear it. In the decades after the war, as the greatest generation narrative took hold and World War II was remembered as a clear-cut battle between good and evil, there was no space for these complicated, uncomfortable truths. The official histories didn't mention the sexual crimes. The memoirs and documentaries focused on heroism, sacrifice, and victory. The veterans who came home were celebrated, and rightly so for their service and sacrifice. But the celebration left no room for accountability. The crimes were buried beneath layers of patriotic narrative and Cold War politics that required maintaining the image of the Anglo-American alliance as unblemished and heroic. Any suggestion that American soldiers had committed crimes was seen as unpatriotic, as dishonoring the dead, as undermining the sacrifice of those who had fought. It wasn't until decades later, when historians began digging through military archives and interviewing survivors, that the full scope of what happened began to emerge. Even then, the revelations were met with resistance. People didn't want to believe it. It complicated the story they had been told about the war. It challenged the narrative of American soldiers as universally heroic liberators. It forced a reckoning with uncomfortable truths about power, about institutions, about the capacity for good and evil to coexist. But the truth is always more complex than the myths we build. The truth is that war creates conditions where the worst of human behavior can flourish alongside the best. The truth is that institutions, even institutions fighting for just causes, will often protect themselves at the expense of the vulnerable. The truth is that ordinary people, when faced with impossible choices, will usually choose self-preservation over moral courage. And the truth is that the few who choose differently, who risk everything to do what's right, are the ones who deserve to be remembered. The Nissen huts themselves began to disappear after the war. As Britain rebuilt and new housing was constructed, the temporary camps were dismantled. The metal structures were sold off, repurposed as farm buildings and storage sheds, or simply left to rust in fields. By the 1960s, most of them were gone. Today, only a handful remain, preserved as historical curiosities or converted into workshops and garages. The communities that lived in them scattered, moving into new council housing or emigrating to start fresh elsewhere. But the stories those huts contained didn't disappear. They were passed down, whispered in families, carried by survivors who never forgot. And slowly, painfully, some of those stories have begun to be told publicly. Archives have been opened. Historians have done the difficult work of documenting what happened. Survivors in their final years have chosen to speak, to ensure that the truth is known before they're gone. The women who were assaulted and never got justice are mostly gone now. The officers who tried to hold criminals accountable have passed away. The witnesses who faced impossible choices have taken their decisions to the grave, but the questions they grappled with remain urgently relevant. How do we balance gratitude and accountability? How do we honor the service and sacrifice of those who fought for freedom, while also acknowledging the crimes some of them committed? How do we create systems that protect the vulnerable even when it's politically inconvenient? How do we ensure that alliances and institutions don't become shields for predators? These aren't historical questions, they're contemporary ones. Military accountability remains a contentious issue in countries around the world. Displaced populations continue to face exploitation and violence in refugee camps and conflict zones. Power imbalances in crisis situations still create conditions where abuse can flourish. The dynamics that played out in those Nissen hut camps in 1944 are playing out today in different contexts, but with the same fundamental patterns. The lesson isn't that we should condemn everyone who served or diminish the genuine heroism that characterized much of the Allied war effort. The lesson is that heroism and criminality can coexist, that institutions will protect themselves unless forced to do otherwise, and that justice requires people willing to risk something to achieve it. The ugly Nissen huts, those corrugated metal tunnels that housed thousands of British families through the coldest winters of the war, became the setting for a moral crisis that most people chose to ignore. But they also became the setting for acts of courage that deserve to be remembered. When a mother chose to report what she witnessed, knowing it would make her a target, that was courage. When an officer refused to drop a case, even after being threatened with court-martial, that was courage. When a victim chose to testify despite the stigma and danger, that was courage. When a community member stood up for a refugee who had no voice, that was courage. These acts didn't always result in justice. Often, they didn't. The system was too powerful, too invested in maintaining the status quo. But the acts mattered anyway. They mattered because they represented a refusal to accept that survival requires moral compromise. They mattered because they demonstrated that even in the darkest circumstances, some people will choose to do what's right regardless of the cost. They mattered because they created a record, a testimony, evidence that not everyone looked away. The fields where the Nissen huts once stood are empty now. The metal tunnels are gone, the communities that lived in them scattered by time and mortality. But if you know the history, if you know what happened in those spaces, the emptiness feels heavy. Those fields hold stories of survival and resilience, of communities formed under impossible circumstances, of ordinary people enduring extraordinary hardship with dignity and mutual support. They also hold stories of violence, injustice, and the failure of institutions to protect the vulnerable. Both stories are true. Both stories matter, and both stories need to be told, because the alternative to telling these stories is forgetting them. And forgetting means we learn nothing. Forgetting means we repeat the same mistakes, create the same conditions, fail the vulnerable in the same ways. Forgetting means that the people who chose courage, who risked everything to do what was right, did so for nothing. We owe them more than that. We owe the victims more than that. We owe ourselves more than that. The ugly Nissen huts were never meant to be permanent. They were emergency measures, temporary solutions to a crisis. But they ended up housing families for years, becoming homes despite their inadequacy. In the same way, the moral compromises that people made during the war, the decisions to stay silent or look away, were meant to be temporary. Survival first, justice later. Get through the war, then deal with the complicated questions. But temporary compromises have a way of becoming permanent. The silence that was expedient in 1944 became the official story. The cases that were buried stayed buried. The victims who were told to wait for justice are still waiting, most of them now dead. That's the real cost of choosing institutional preservation over individual justice. It's not just the immediate harm, though that's devastating enough. It's the long-term message it sends, that some people's trauma matters less than other people's comfort, that some crimes are acceptable if prosecuting them would be inconvenient, that power protects power. The people who refused to accept that message, who insisted that justice mattered even when it was difficult, even when it was dangerous, are the ones who point us toward a better way. They didn't succeed in changing the system. The system was too entrenched, too powerful. But they succeeded in demonstrating that the system could be challenged, that individuals could choose differently, that moral courage was possible even in impossible circumstances. That's the legacy worth preserving. Not the myth of unblemished heroism, but the reality of complex human beings making difficult choices in terrible circumstances. Some chose badly, some chose well, and the difference between those choices is everything. The corrugated metal walls of the Nissen huts were thin and cold. They provided minimal shelter from the winter wind, but they were shelter nonetheless. And for thousands of families, they were the difference between survival and catastrophe. In the same way, the acts of courage by those who chose to speak up, to investigate, to protect the vulnerable, were small and often ineffective against the larger forces arrayed against them. But they were acts of shelter nonetheless, providing protection to people who had nowhere else to turn. When everyone else chose to look away, some chose to see. When everyone else chose silence, some chose to speak. When everyone else chose safety, some chose justice. Those choices didn't change the world, but they changed individual lives. They meant that some victims got justice, some predators faced consequences, some vulnerable people were protected. And in the end, that's what moral courage looks like. Not grand gestures that transform systems overnight, but small acts of resistance against injustice, performed by ordinary people who decided that they couldn't live with themselves if they did nothing. The ugly Nissen huts are gone. The people who lived in them are mostly gone. But the questions they faced, the choices they made, echo forward into our present. We face the same questions about accountability and alliance, about protecting the vulnerable versus protecting institutions, about the cost of speaking up versus the cost of staying silent. The history of those metal tunnels in the English countryside, and the moral crisis that unfolded within and around them, offers no easy answers, but it offers something more valuable, a reminder that the choices we make in moments of crisis define who we are, and that courage, even when it fails to achieve immediate justice, still matters profoundly, because the alternative is a world where power is never challenged, where the vulnerable are never protected, where convenience always trumps justice. And that world, history shows us, is one where the worst of human behavior flourishes unchecked. The Nissen huts were ugly. Everyone agreed on that. But they housed thousands of families through the darkest years of the war. And in their cold metal spaces, some people made choices that revealed the most beautiful aspects of human character. The willingness to risk everything for what's right, even when success is unlikely and the cost is high. That's the story worth remembering. That's the legacy worth preserving. Not the comfortable myth, but the complicated truth. Not the easy narrative, but the difficult reality. Not the silence that protects institutions, but the courage that protects people. The fields are empty now, but the stories remain. And as long as we tell them, as long as we remember both the failures and the courage, there's hope that we might do better, when we face our own impossible choices. If you found this story powerful, please subscribe to our channel to ensure more hidden histories like this reach the people who need to hear them. Your like helps this video break through the algorithm and reach viewers who care about untold truths. And we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Did you know about the Nissen huts and the moral crises they witnessed? What stories from your own family's history deserve to be told? Join the conversation below. Together we can make sure these voices are never silenced again.